Hey there, everyone. That sexy nerd is back again, and we're doing episode 3 of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Now, that again, this episode, the last episode was crazy. His wife was a hero in the wars. She was a tough woman, and no wonder he was. And it didn't scare him away. He was man enough to say, "Hey, that's sexy," instead of, "Ugh, I don't like that she's better than me." Ugh. Gayest thing I've ever heard. But anyway, I really want to know what happens in this episode. This is going to be the year of 1848, and this is basically when this, like I said in the last video, this might be the beginning of the birth of the modern era. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but in my opinion, that year was like one of the most important years in our history, our world history. So why don't we just get into it? And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, please check out my Patreon for all my full-length reactions to all my latest videos. Let's do this thing, y'all.
1849. 2 months before, the assassination of a Vatican official had spurred revolution. Masses had flooded the streets and seized government buildings, putting a tricolor flag into the statue of Marcus Aurelius. The Pope had fled, and the Roman Republic declared. But now, multiple armies are coming to crush Rome, and all hope seemed lost. That is until Garibaldi's arrival. For the people have heard of his revolutionary adventures in South America, about his legendary red shirts, about how he'd been captured and tortured by the Brazilians, and once fought an army thousands strong with only 190 men. He appears now larger than life, his long hair and hat disguising a bullet scar on his neck, his battle-hardened wife Anita riding beside him. Yet, many among Garibaldi's proud band will soon be corpses, scattered amongst the rubble of the ancient city. For the French are coming, and bringing heavy guns with them. 1 year earlier, when Garibaldi first arrived back in Italy after 14 years' absence, he didn't receive the welcome he'd expected as an internationally famous revolutionary. In fact, his official reception was the opposite of the one he'd eventually get in Rome, that is to say, frosty. See, he'd returned because the time seemed right for him to continue his struggle for Italy, and the election of a new Pope, Pius IX, in 1846 had raised hopes, since he appeared open to liberal reforms. Then a season of revolution began. First, Sicily rose in revolt against its monarch from the French House of Bourbon and began setting up a constitution. Then similar uprisings flared across Italy, from Venice to Lombardy to Modena and Reggio. The people of Tuscany thronged the streets, successfully pressuring their Grand Duke to issue a constitution, and the people of Piedmont Sardinia followed suit. In Milan, civilian militias drove the Austrian army out of their city in 5 days of brutal street fighting, immortalized as the 5 Days of Milan, triggering an Austrian intervention that began the First War of Italian Unification. This was the beginning of what Garibaldi's friend, the radical head of Young Italy, Giuseppe Mazzini, dubbed the Risorgimento, or resurgence, a term that would lend itself to both the era and the process of Italian unification. But despite Garibaldi's international renown as a guerrilla leader and revolutionary, he had difficulty finding himself a place in this chaotic landscape of new constitutions and tricolor flags. His first instinct was to return to Piedmont Sardinia and offer his services to King Charles Albert, who was gearing up to fight the Austrians. But when Charles Albert had accepted a constitution and was talking up the possibility of unifying northern Italy, he spurned Garibaldi. See, while Charles Albert did dream of kicking the Austrians out and uniting the whole peninsula, he was still a monarchist opposed to Republicans like Garibaldi and Mazzini. He wanted to unite Italy, sure, he just wanted to rule the whole thing. So Charles Albert suggested Garibaldi go to Venice. And when he arrived, he found their ideals ill-matched as well. For the Venetians didn't care about liberal ideas or unification, they just wanted their old Republic of Venice back. In fact, as Garibaldi toured Italy looking for an assignment, he came to realize a hard truth. All of these uprisings were highly local and shared few common goals. He wound up instead in the service of Milan, who let him recruit 500 volunteers, but provided no weapons or funds to equip them. Plus, rather than red shirts, they had to temporarily settle for a load of billowy white ones that made them look a bit like, he observed, a battalion of cooks. There, he tried to demonstrate the guerrilla tactics he'd learned in South America, and prove their viability in fighting against Austria. But his small successes were overshadowed by major Austrian victories, breaking Charles Albert's Piedmontese army and forcing him to abdicate in favor of his son, Victor Emmanuel II. Garibaldi, meanwhile, marched around Italy trying to scrape up volunteers and supplies, at times even extorting the peasantry for rations. He even hid in Switzerland for a spell. But then, a summons he received changed everything. He was needed at Rome. In February, a revolutionary had stabbed a powerful Roman government official to death, sort of a tradition around those parts back then, triggering a citywide uprising. Crowds seized the squares, and Pope Pius fled in a coach, literally wearing, no joke, a big pair of glasses as a disguise. For a government, the rebels voted in a representative assembly and triumvirate that included Mazzini as one of its three heads. So now, Garibaldi had his battleground, the eternal city of Rome. He was elected part of its constituent assembly and began preparing defenses for the two armies they knew were coming. Pius, after all, was the Pope, and he'd gotten two highly Catholic kingdoms, France and Naples, to pledge to restore him. For political reasons, Garibaldi was not technically in command of the defense. That had to be someone Roman, but he was the most notable commander. Unfortunately, his Italian legion were not exactly veterans. A few were old followers from South America, such as Anita and his chief aide, a formerly enslaved man he'd fought with in Uruguay. But the rest were largely civilians, students mostly, who were eager but not well trained.
I wonder how that conversation went. They probably were like, you know, the Italian guys are like being incredibly racist. It's like, oh boy, that must have caused some dissension.
At least he finally found his troops some red shirts to replace those billowy white ones. And he would have a chance to use those new uniforms on April 30th, 1849, when the French army reached the gates of Rome. The French had assumed the Republic troops would flee at first volley.
No.
They carried no scaling ladders or siege tools. In fact, they were so sure there wouldn't be a fight that when the first pair of cannons fired at them from the walls, a French officer dismissed it as a noonday gun. The ancient walls lit up with gunfire, cutting the lead French.
Did he get hit?
Then Garibaldi's red shirts sallied out in a frontal charge. "Come on, boys," Garibaldi yelled, waving his saber atop his white horse. "Put the French to fight like a massive carrion. Forward with the bayonet." Red shirts barreled into the enemy, stabbing and firing, even clawing at their foe with their fingernails.
What?
Stunned, the French called retreat, leaving 500 casualties and over 350 prisoners.
500?
Garibaldi requested to follow up the attack, but Mazzini, determined to show their war was defensive, called a ceasefire. Instead, Garibaldi was sent to halt the expeditionary force coming from Naples. His legion successfully stopped the Neapolitans in a brutal 3-hour fight on May 9th, then defeated it a second time 10 days later, sending it into full retreat. But it was only buying time. The French were only negotiating as they waited for a contingent of 30,000 reinforcements. And on June 3rd, the French broke the truce a day early in a massive assault. Garibaldi met them everywhere. He battled them on his white horse, turning exquisite villas into forts, and fighting through the plazas and alleys of the old city. More than once, his red shirt hid injuries, so his men did not know he'd been wounded. Anita continued to prove her worth, taking command of a red shirt detachment to drive off an attack. But there were losses as well. His aide and companion from Brazil, who had liberated himself from slavery, died in the defense. Another of his favorite aides, a boy of 21 who had written the lyrics to a new patriotic song that Garibaldi liked to hum in combat, took a bullet in the thigh. Despite an amputation, the youth died a lingering death of gangrene, never knowing that his song would eventually become Italy's national anthem. Things turned even worse on day 2, when the French took a hill overlooking Rome, allowing them to bombard the city with heavy artillery. Yet even as friends fell dead around him, Garibaldi remained defiant. Each dawn, he went to the wall to smoke cigarettes, letting the snipers take shots at him. He took over a villa as
I
his
gotta say, he's
headquarters,
a badass.
and despite the shelling, invited officers to attend elaborate multi-course dinners in the garden. Attendance was sparse, however, as several nights in a row, officers eating with Garibaldi were eviscerated by artillery. But by the end of June, even the indomitable Garibaldi could see that the Roman Republic was no longer tenable. His friendship with Mazzini had also broken as they argued over policy and strategy. Mazzini's monetary policies had caused hyperinflation, and Garibaldi was furious that the triumvirate had fallen for the bad faith negotiations France had used to recover from their early loss. On June 30th, he slammed into a meeting of the triumvirate, still covered in blood from fighting in the streets. The trio was discussing whether to keep fighting in Rome, evacuate and start guerrilla operations in the mountains, or surrender. Garibaldi insisted they evacuate, then continue the fight. "Wherever we go," he said, "that will be Rome." Mazzini and the others opted for a negotiated surrender. And Garibaldi, battered, bleeding, his friends dead, and his Anita weak from another pregnancy and illness, left Rome with 4,000 troops,
15 kids.
those that would fight on. But some, like Anita, would not fight for much longer. And if you want to see...
Wow. So, it's starting to get sad. That's so sad that the kid ended up writing the Italian national anthem before he died. That's so sad, man. He never got to see his song become a complete success. Oh, or at least go down in history. That's so sad. Yeah, I love this guy. This guy's got balls, man. He's got them balls, and hopefully everything works out for him. I don't think it all did, but you know. Again, well, it did. Italy was unified, but I bet you it was not under his as his design. Kind of similarly to Simon Bolivar, which I honestly should probably do his videos on. Let me know if you want me to do that in the comments below. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if they go to share. And remember, check out my Patreon for all my full-length reactions to all my latest videos. And I'll see you on the next episode.